Are you interested in astrophotography and wish to do compelling images of the night sky, but you're quite confused what settings to use or just generally new to this topic? Well, in today's video, I'm going to share my exact settings, but not just that, but also my best practices and tips so you can have the best possible preparations and requirements for your own photography. So if you're keen to learn about that, then let's get into this.
You just gotta get out there and press your shutter.
Hey, we're just meeting. My name is Dylan Carvalho and I do photography related content to help young photographers realize their photographic ambitions and visions. Before I even get to the exact settings, we have to establish the required equipment to succeed in night sky photography. So the first thing you'll want is a tripod to stabilize your camera as we're using a low shutter speed. And the second thing you need is basically just a camera that shoots in manual mode. Now what we want to do is to shoot in RAW. You'll definitely want to shoot with RAW files so you have the biggest control over your post-production, and also make sure to use a trigger. But if you don't actually have a trigger, it's not a big deal. You can just use a delayed trigger function that most cameras will have, so to minimize the camera shake as we press the shutter. So that way we will minimize our camera shake and we have the cleanest image possible. Now, one of the most important things that we have to establish is to get our focus right. So to get our stars nice and sharp, we have to switch to manual focus and establish focus to infinity. So there's two ways to establish your infinity focus. One being that during the day, you can go and look for a horizon or very far object, like maybe a mountain range, and then basically zoom in on your LCD and get it as sharp as possible. And that way you will determine your infinity focus for your lens, knowing that each lens has a different infinity focus. So the lens you will use for your night sky photography, basically mark it at that spot where your horizon is sharp, or just simply take a picture and that will let you know where your infinity focus is at your lens. The second way how to establish it is basically on live location. So if you don't have the time to get out during the day or whatnot, and you're just out and about, then no worries. You can basically point your camera to a very bright star or the moon and then zoom in and get it as sharp as possible. And that way, again, you will establish your infinity focus, then leave it on manual and don't touch it again. Okay, so we got our equipment right, we got our raw files, and we got our focus right. Now it's time to set the settings. And the first setting I want to discuss is shutter speed, because this is the easiest setting to determine. Now the shutter speed we established with the 500 rule. The 500 rule basically dictates what your maximum shutter speed can be, so to avoid having star trails and have sharp stars. So basically you'll take 500 divided by your focal length of your lens and then applying your sensor as well, and that gives you the maximum shutter speed. So I have a full frame sensor with a 24mm lens, which gives me 20 seconds to work with. So 20 seconds of a shutter speed is my maximum. Again, depending on the lens and camera you use, they can very much differ, but basically that just determines and dictates what maximum shutter speed you can use, so not to have any star trails in your images. Now, as you see, the bigger your focal length, the less room you have to use the shutter speed, because obviously with a zoomed in angle, the star trails become more evident. Now, knowing that the focal length influences our shutter speed, I'll highly encourage you to use the smallest or widest focal length possible if you're using any zoom lenses. Second on the line is aperture, and aperture is important to determine our depth of field. So if your lens is restricted to 4.5 or 5.6, I'll just advise you to use your lowest aperture possible and don't worry about it anymore, because that way we don't have to raise our ISO as much. If you can go all the way to 1.4 or 2.8, even better. But even then, I wouldn't go all the way to 1.4 because you still want to have some depth of field. So I personally use between 2.8 to 4.5 or 5.6, so in between that range you're very good to go. Now the last and probably most controversial setting is ISO. ISO basically raises the sensitivity of your sensor and therefore increases the noise of your image. Obviously you're gonna have a brighter image, but also the noise will be the compromise of that. But trust me, you will rather have a noisy image than an underexposed image, or therefore no image at all. So what I encourage you to do is, after you've determined your shutter speed, and your aperture, increase your ISO step by step until you get to an exposure where you're happy, where the night sky and everything is well lit, and then just go with that. Don't think that if you go to ISO 1000 or even 2,000-3,000, then you have a very noisy image that you can work with. You'd rather have a noisy image than no image at all. The best example I can give you on that particular topic is when I was trying to shoot the bloody moon some years ago, and I was using a long lens obviously, and therefore I was restricted to an aperture of 5.6, and I went all the way to 30 seconds of a shutter speed, and then still I had to raise my ISO up to 2000, and you can see obviously there's noise in the image, but again, you rather have a noisy image than no image at all. Hey, let me know if you're getting any value out of this, and if you're learning new things, and let me know what you've learned so far, and if you've started with astrophotography already, or if you're still intending to do so. And if you did enjoy this video so far, then make sure to smash the like button. Now let's look at some examples to give you some perspective as to what settings can actually influence in your photography. Now if we look at the first image, we can definitely see the stars trailing compared to the second one, where the stars are way sharper, and this is due to the shutter speed. In the first one I'm using 30 seconds compared to 15 seconds, and remember my maximum shutter speed is 20 seconds, so I'm totally within that in the second image. And in the first one I wasn't even worried about that because I was going for star trails. So depending on what you want, you actually don't even have to look for the 500 rule, especially if you're going for star trails. Now the second thing I want you to look at is the ISO. The ISO, again, I want you to raise step by step, and according to the scene it will vary. So in the second frame I had a lot of moonlight, so that's why the ISO is way lower. So after establishing shutter speed and aperture, just raise your ISO step by step. Okay, so let's quickly recap. We have our equipment, we have our raw files, we have our focus set, and we have our setting set. But now I want you to walk through my exact procedure when I arrive at scene, so to give you an idea how I operate and to maximize your overall experience when shooting night sky. So the first thing I'll establish is always my shutter speed, applying the 500 rule that we've just learned. But remember, if you're going for star trails, you don't even have to worry about it because you don't want to prevent your stars from trailing, or you don't have to necessarily. After that, if I haven't acquired the focus for infinity during the day, I will do that on live location by using the ISO to raise it up all the way up, so to basically have the LCD screen lit and to see the stars and the moon. And by that you can basically point it to the moon or a very bright star, and then manually focus to the sharpest point possible. Then leave it on manual and don't touch your focus again. And after that you can compose your frame and look for the image you want to take. After setting our infinity focus, we can set our ISO to 100 again and proceed with aperture. And with aperture, go to the lowest f-stop possible and then raise it step by step, taking test images and see if you're happy with the depth of field. Obviously, if you're restricted to 4.5 or maybe 5.6 by using a long lens, then I'll just encourage you to go to the lowest f-stop possible. Again, I like to use f2.8 to f4. Reason being for that is that I rather compromise my depth of field for not having such a noisy image. So I'd rather have f2.8 and ISO 1000 than f8 and maybe ISO 5000, if that makes sense to you, but that is just my personal opinion. Now we can just proceed with ISO and basically again raise it step by step, taking test images and look at the exposure, and as a reference point you can just look at the histogram, and again you rather have a noisy image than no image at all. All you have to do now is just to use a trigger or a delayed trigger function. Thank you so much for joining me in this episode. I hope I increased your knowledge about astrophotography and how to get a well exposed night sky image, and in that sense I'll encourage you to go out and make awesome images.